Snow hammered the camp in sheets that erased distance and sound. Corwin crouched beneath the overturned handcar, his gloves stiff with ice, his breath drifting sideways as if pushed by an unseen hand. Metal bit into his palms when he loosened the first bolt, a flash of pain cutting through the numbness before fading back into the deeper cold. The wind clawed under the frame, trying to wrench the tools from his grasp, but he tightened his grip and kept working because stopping meant surrendering to a night that already felt too close. The storm carried no rhythm. It surged in uneven bursts, each one rattling the handcar above him and sending a tremor down the buried rails. Snow spilled through every gap, filling the hollow space around his knees, turning movement into labor. Somewhere beyond the drifted tents, faint silhouettes shuffled without direction, their forms flickering against a darkness that swallowed even the memory of fire. He could sense their unease in the air, a tension sharper than the cold, shaped by the knowledge that no flame or lantern remained to anchor their night. He angled the lamp housing toward the faintest scrap of reflected sky, though the storm smothered even that. The bearings resisted his touch, frozen in place, refusing to turn for him or for anyone desperate enough to believe motion alone could summon light. His breath thickened against the metal, a brief cloud rising and fading before the wind tore it away. For a moment he paused, listening to the strange hush beneath the storm, that thin chamber of silence where hope felt both impossible and necessary. And when the rails groaned beneath another violent gust, he pressed deeper under the handcar because the darkness demanded more. The wind answered with a long, low cry through iron. The darkness pressed harder than the cold, shaping itself into something almost sentient as it settled over the stranded camp. Corwin eased himself farther beneath the handcar, feeling the ground pulse with each gust that swept across the ridge. Snow packed into every crease of the timber supports, hissing as it found the warmth of his sleeves and melted just long enough to chill him deeper. The storm showed no mercy. It stripped the world of shape, erased the horizon, and left only the grinding silence of workers who no longer trusted their own senses. A few figures moved near the collapsed cook tent, barely more than shifting shadows. Their steps were uneven, guided less by sight and more by instinct, hands brushing along ropes and rails to confirm they were not alone in the void. Fear lived quietly among them. Not a panicked fear, but the kind that creeps from the edges when night feels heavy enough to swallow memory. Without lanterns, the camp became a single unbroken mass of shadow, tents dissolving into the landscape as if the mountain meant to reclaim them. Corwin felt the pressure of that fear as keenly as the frost stiffening his gloves. Darkness disrupted routine, turned simple tasks into hazards, made every misplaced step a potential injury they could not afford. Even the wind carried a warning, dragging across canvas like claws testing for weakness. He could sense the men withdrawing inward, each breath shorter, each pause longer, the cold tugging at their resolve. The storm was not the true enemy, it was merely the instrument. The real threat lay in how quickly hope drained when light vanished, how silence expanded until thought itself felt brittle. And as another gust tore through the camp, the night tightened around them like a closing fist. The ridge stretched for miles in both directions, a broken line of unfinished track climbing toward a summit that remained hidden behind drifting white. Corwin shifted his weight beneath the handcar, feeling the frozen timber press into his shoulders as he worked by touch. The railway had brought them here during the late season, when the final push toward the pass seemed possible, but the storm turned that optimism into a fragile memory. Iron rails lay half-buried, their surfaces glazed with frost, each segment a record of labor halted too abruptly. The camp itself clung to the mountainside with the stubbornness of those who believed progress could outpace weather. They had come with enough supplies for typical winter squalls, trusting in stored kerosene and the reliability of paraffin candles. But the storm's fury had stolen both. A collapsed fuel crate, a toppled lantern, a spark swallowed too quickly. Small accidents compounded into a single catastrophic truth. No fire remained. Even the emergency batteries meant for telegraph relays had frozen solid, their casings cracked from the cold. Across the camp, men huddled close to canvas walls, listening to wind drag against every seam and wondering how long bodies could endure without warmth or orientation. Corwin knew the mountain favored the storm. Valleys funneled the wind upward, the altitude thinning the air until sound lost weight. Tools left out for minutes grew rimed with white. Food froze before it could be eaten. Without light, the risk multiplied. Rails became ice-slick traps, guy lines turned into invisible hazards, and every footstep required memory rather than vision. He understood these stakes not as abstractions, but as calculations made from nights spent repairing telegraph stations in bitter weather. And as the ridge shook under another blast, the reality settled deeper. Survival hinged on creating a new source of light before the dark unraveled them further. Snow gathered in slow, deliberate layers across the overturned handcar, each new deposit softening the outline until only Corwin's steady movements kept it recognizable. He pressed his shoulder against the frame to gain leverage, fingers numb beneath the stiff leather of his gloves as he coaxed a stubborn bolt into place. The cold had begun to settle into the men in ways no one voiced outright. Their steps grew shorter, their hands lingered, too long inside pockets, and their breaths came in shallow bursts that fogged the air before vanishing into the storm's deeper breath. Endurance became a quiet negotiation with the elements, measured by the smallest motions that still pushed back against the night. Nearby, a tent sagged under the weight of wet snow, its ropes creaking in uneven intervals. A worker emerged to shake the canvas free. His movements slow, his posture hunched, as though he feared the darkness would solidify around him if he stayed outside too long. Another man crouched near the supply crates, searching for tools by feel alone, brushing frost from their surfaces and pausing every few seconds as if listening for something beneath the wind. No one spoke. The silence was not chosen. It simply rose from each of them, a shared instinct to conserve breath and energy when neither could be wasted. Corwin felt the strain building across the camp like a taut wire. His own hands trembled when he reached for the next piece of scrap. A telegraph coil salvaged earlier, its copper winding dulled by age but still intact beneath the frost. He worked by memory and stubborn belief, scraping ice from the metal, aligning pieces the storm tried repeatedly to scatter. Every adjustment cost strength he could not easily spare, yet forward motion was all that kept uncertainty from deepening. And when the wind shifted, carrying a low groan along the rails, the night pressed closer in reply. A tremor of motion traveled through the handcar frame as Corwin eased the makeshift coil into position, the curve of copper catching what little contrast existed between metal and storm. The idea had lived with him for months, sketched in margins of his weather-beaten notebook, suspended between theory and necessity until the night forced it fully into his hands. He withdrew the notebook now, its pages stiff with frozen edges, the graphite lines wavering where past rains had blurred the shapes. Diagrams of rotating shafts tangled with notes on magnetic fields. Each sketch a reminder that motion alone could summon a current strong enough to coax light from darkness. The storm had stolen fire, but it had not robbed them of possibility. A few workers drifted closer, drawn not by understanding but by the intent radiating from Corwin's posture. They knelt beside the handcar, brushing snow aside to uncover scattered bearings, twisted wire, and fragments of telegraph components once meant for distant signals. Their faces remained shadowed, yet he sensed curiosity surfacing through the exhaustion, the fragile hope that knowledge might do what flame could not. A man placed an iron crank into Corwin's reach, its surface pitted but strong enough to survive one more attempt at purpose. Another offered a length of belt leather, stiff and cracked, but useful for tensioning the improvised spindle. Corwin aligned the coil with deliberate care, seating the magnets along the axis where motion would matter most. Imagined the crank turning, the coil spinning, the magnetic field cutting through copper in a rhythm that could push electrons along a filament. No certainty accompanied the vision, only the quiet determination that comes when the world narrows to a single necessary task. And as the storm surged once more across the ridge, the possibility of light drew nearer in the dark. Wind slipped beneath the handcar as Corwin tightened the last bolt. The coil, now seated with a precision, earned more through instinct than visibility. He threaded the leather strap around the improvised spindle, testing its tension with a slow pull that made the frame shudder. The men nearby leaned in as if proximity might warm the air, their breaths rising in faint clouds that vanished before reaching the handcar's iron skin. Corwin positioned the crank, feeling its uneven weight shift in his grip, and braced his boots against the frozen ground. Motion was the only path forward, and motion demanded strength he no longer felt certain he possessed. The first turn resisted him. Metal scraped against metal in a gritty protest, the spindle wobbling as the coil dragged through its arc. A second turn followed, smoother but strained, the magnets holding their alignment by sheer will and rusted friction. The wind gusted hard, rattling the frame, yet he kept the rhythm, slow and persistent, each rotation carving a faint vibration through the bearings. The men watched without speaking, their silence shaped by equal parts doubt and longing. A single bulb waited beside the frame, its filament dark but intact, the glass trembling with each shift of the storm. Corwin increased the pace, pushing past the ache in his wrists, driving the spindle faster until the vibration changed timbre. A thin hum emerged, fragile, tentative, rising through the coil like a whispered acknowledgement of effort. The leather strap warmed slightly under friction, a muted scent of singed fibers drifting upward. Then, without warning, the bulb flickered. Just once, a faint pulse like a heartbeat startled into being, before fading back to shadow. Another rotation brought a longer glow, a trembling thread of orange drifting through the filament before collapsing into dark again. And as Corwin cranked harder, chasing that fragile shimmer, the storm paused in its assault as though assessing this first defiance. The glow steadied after several more rotations, a thin but undeniable line of light threading itself through the filament until faces emerged from the darkness in soft, wavering contours. Corwin kept the crank moving, his motions uneven yet relentless, while the men watched the bulb as though witnessing a star born too close to Earth. Light expanded across the snow in a fragile arc, revealing the ridged patterns of wind-sculpted drifts and the battered canvas of nearby tents. What moments before had been a void now held shape again, and in that returned shape, the men rediscovered orientation, purpose, and something resembling steadiness. The bulb's trembling glow served as their anchor, a reminder that the night could be challenged after all. Word traveled quickly through the camp. Figures emerged from shelters, drawn toward the improbable brightness beating back the storm's shadow. Their footsteps deepened in the snow, hesitant at first, then more certain as they approached the handcar and the mechanism turning within it. Some carried scrap metal, others rusted gears or lengths of wire salvaged from abandoned telegraph posts. Improvised tools passed from hand to hand, their cold surfaces biting into bare skin as the men assembled additional components with a determination sharpened by renewed hope. Light had awakened something dormant. Collaboration replacing silence, curiosity displacing dread. Across the ridge, the faint shimmer reached distant tents, where workers paused mid-task to stare toward the improbable glow. Even those who had resigned themselves to endurance alone felt a shift, a subtle loosening of the cold's psychological grip. The storm had not lessened, yet its authority no longer felt absolute. A small circle of illumination grew around the handcar, widening with each successful rotation, a beacon rippling outward through the camp like a whispered promise. And as the glow strengthened, the night yielded a fraction more, unwilling but undeniably altered. A deeper hum settled into the coil as Corwin maintained the rhythm, the spindle turning with a rough steadiness that sent subtle vibrations through the frame. Light wavered but held, its glow tracing the contours of nearby tools as if revealing a mathematics hidden beneath frost. The men watched the mechanism with a reverence normally reserved for relics, sensing the presence of forces older than the rail itself moving through copper and magnet. Corwin felt the physics not as abstraction but as texture, the slight drag each time the magnetic field resisted the coil's passage, the faint lift when momentum overcame that resistance. Motion became current, current became warmth, warmth became the fragile bloom of light in a world that had nearly forgotten it. The storm raged around them, yet the glow carved a space where thought could gather. Faraday's principles, once distant ideas scribbled in the margins of manuals, lived now in the rough spin of a hand-carried crank. Corwin understood the elegance behind the crude assembly. Rotation slicing through magnetic lines, electrons jostled into motion. A filament coaxed into radiance through nothing more than disciplined persistence. That simplicity deepened the awe. It revealed a truth the mountain could not strip away. Light did not require flame, only motion shaped with intention. The men sensed this even without the vocabulary for it. Their eyes lingered on the coil's rhythm, on the faint shimmer that pulsed in time with each turn of the crank, on the way iron and copper responded to unseen laws. The storm might extinguish fires, freeze batteries, and silence telegraph lines, but it could not prevent a principle from living. And as the hum grew steadier, a quiet understanding spread through the circle of workers. Survival rested not on what they had lost, but on what they could still create. The wind pressed close again, testing their resolve. Years later, long after the rails had finally crossed the pass and the camps dissolved back into stone and memory, visitors walked the ridge without sensing the weight it once carried. The storm-scoured ground held few signs of struggle, only a faint depression where tents once stood and a scatter of rusted nails half swallowed by lichen. Yet one artifact remained. An iron hand-crank dynamo resting beside a modest marker, its bearings fused by time, its coil darkened to the color of old earth. Snow gathered inside its hollow as if nature sought to reclaim even this small defiance, but the shape endured, stubborn as the men who once knelt beside it. Travelers paused, studying the device with casual curiosity, guessing at its purpose before moving on. Some assumed it had served the telegraph line. Others believed it part of a surveyor's tool. Few recognized its true role, for modern eyes saw only a crude machine dwarfed by the abundance of effortless light in their own world. Electricity arrived now with a switch, a gesture too simple to evoke reverence, leaving history's improvisations to fade beneath convenience. Corwin's coil, once coaxed into life by cold hands and exhausted arms, seemed small compared to the sleek power systems that dominated the age. Yet the principle behind it, motion drawn into meaning, remained unchanged, a thread of continuity between epochs. Those who lingered longest sensed something deeper. They traced the curve of the crank, imagining the resistance of leather, the rising hum, the filament trembling awake. The ridge wind carried echoes if one listened closely, the quiet determination of men discovering that ingenuity could be stronger than isolation. Light had once carved a fragile sanctuary here, a brief refuge against the storm's authority, and as the sky dimmed behind drifting clouds, the memory of that first glow seemed to hover again at the edge of dusk. Even on that final night before the storm relented, Corwin kept the crank turning long after the men no longer needed its glow to steady their steps. The bulb cast a wavering circle across the snow, its modest warmth gathering around boots and gloves and weathered faces that had forgotten the comfort of seeing one another clearly. He felt the ache in his wrists deepen, a slow burn moving through the tendons, yet he welcomed it. Effort meant motion, and motion meant light, and light meant they would endure until dawn reclaimed the ridge. The handcar shuddered with each rotation, the coil humming in a tone that seemed almost alive, as if the mountain itself listened for the outcome of their labor. The men lingered in that glow, repairing tools, melting frost from canvas seams, or simply standing still to feel the rare assurance that darkness no longer dictated their thoughts. The storm continued its assault, but its dominance had fractured. Illumination carved a narrow refuge where silence felt contemplative instead of consuming. Corwin watched the others rediscover small tasks once abandoned to fear, their faces softening as the light steadied, each man carrying himself with a posture revived by purpose. Exhaustion remained, yet it no longer overshadowed them. Light had rewritten their night. When he finally eased the crank to a slower rhythm, the bulb dimmed but did not vanish, holding a faint heart of orange that pulsed in time with the last turns. The men gathered their tools with quiet reverence, sensing the significance of what they had witnessed. Corwin stepped back, letting the glow rest against the snow, feeling the weight of the moment settle into memory. The storm murmured along the rails, but its claim over them had faded, and as the bulb's final shimmer drifted outward, it echoed the truth that had carried them through the dark. They had made their own dawn. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive.